Good morning again, everybody. Today we are going to carry on our study of the Great War. We're going to look at the MAIN, causes of the Great War. MAIN is an acronym for some of the different things that happened. Before we go too far, I need you to download a couple of things. I want you to make sure that you have downloaded the Main Causes of the Great War PowerPoint notes. And you're also going to need this one here. It's called The Assassination of the Archduke Franz Ferdinand. And you're going to need both of those in order to complete today's assignment. This is a fairly in-depth explanation, so this is going to take several days. So today we are only going to go as far as, the actual assassination that began the whole war. So let's get started. So as we begin, we have to ask ourselves, is this really the First World War? And I think you know the answer to that. We have already studied two other wars that could qualify. One would have been the War of 1812 and also the 7 Years' War, both of which affected Canada. But they're not named as world wars because at the time it was the European countries and their colonies, and that's how the war ended up being around the world, is because it was through the colonial powers. So it wasn't until World War I that you had independent countries from all over being involved in this. As an overview, one of the things that we should know is that this is the first total war. What is a total war? It means that both soldiers and civilians are specifically targeted. Now, obviously soldiers have always been targeted, and in every war prior, civilians have always ended up as casualties of war, but until World War I, they were never the specific targets. A total of 20 million soldiers, that includes both sides, were killed. Think about that number. That is an enormous number of men to be killed. But 38 million civilians on both sides were killed. So a total of about 58 to 60 million people worldwide died as a result of this war. So my question then is, what are the implications of the death tolls when you compare the soldiers to civilians? Well, it looks kind of obvious, doesn't it? You're better off actually being a soldier because you were twice as likely to survive. Twice as many civilians were killed as soldiers. The implication could be that if war comes to your territory, probably better off being a soldier. So, in June of 1914, the situation was only a regional dispute between Austria-Hungary and Serbia. We'll get into that in a little bit, but essentially what had happened was that Serbia had decided that they wanted to take over Bosnia. They went about it in a roundabout way, and in doing so, they came up with this plan to assassinate the heir to the Austro-Hungarian Empire. So, of course, Austria is very annoyed, and they are going after Serbia because Serbia planned it. However, by August, because of all those different power blocks that we did on those maps, by August, there were 7 countries that had declared war and were moving troops. And those countries were the Austro-Hungarian Empire, Serbia, Russia, Germany, France, Great Britain, and Italy. As this war goes on, battles will be fought in Europe, in Asia, in Africa, and on and under the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans. What is the implication when I say under? And of course that is that at this point in time, submarines will have been invented. There were a lot of changes that resulted from this war. there were revolutions, like the Russian Revolution. This one, the Russian Revolution was the result of the Tsar sending more and more and more and more poor Russian men to the front lines. The rich never were asked to contribute their sons or sacrifice their sons, but the Tsar seemed to have absolutely no problem sacrificing tens and hundreds of thousands of his own men. Well, the poor people got very, very upset by this, and obviously by a whole bunch of other things that had been happening at the time. And so in 1917, the Russian Revolution began, and as a result, the whole outlook of Russia changed completely. There were also changes in governments. Germany, which up until that time had been a fairly progressive country, decided at the end of this war that they needed a strong, and I put that in sort of those air quotes, leader. And they ended up electing Hitler as a result. In Italy, at the end of the war, the Italian people were so embarrassed and so frustrated by the way that they had been treated at the Treaty of Versailles, and they thought that their leader had been the reason that they had been treated so badly, and so they kicked him out and they elected somebody, again, who they thought of as a very strong leader, and they ended up with Benito Mussolini. This is also the end of all the empires. Didn't matter which side of the war you fought on, both sides ended up losing the concept of empire, and there were a lot of reasons around that. There were great new powers rose, the Soviet Union, so Russia stopped being Russia per se, and became the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, and that would carry on as a superpower until the 1990s. And of course, let's not forget that one of the changes was that millions of people were dead, and a lot of those were young men, and that meant that the generation was kind of decimated, and that had implications for the next generation anyway. So by the end of the war in 1918, remember, 7 countries in 1914, but by 1918, over 30 countries were involved in the conflict. So I've mentioned about an assassination, and the guy that was assassinated was named Franz Ferdinand. So who was this guy? He was the heir to the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Now, he was not the son of the emperor. He was the nephew. But the emperor didn't have a son, so Franz was the next in line. So he would, at some point, inherit the empire. He was very different from his uncle. His uncle was very authoritarian, he was going to put the jackboot down on anybody who didn't agree with him. He was a very, very strict man. But Franz Ferdinand, on the other hand, he was a reformer. He didn't like a lot of his uncle's policies, and he had huge plans to make changes. And one of the changes he had planned was to give the Bosnians a larger voice in government and restore lots of their cultural and language rights. Now, what this would have done would have been to make Bosnia happy, because they would have got what they wanted. They would have gotten their culture and their language respected. They would have had political say. It would have made the Bosnians happy. But that is what made Franz Ferdinand a target, because Serbia did not want Bosnia to be happy. So, what had happened was, like 700 years before this, Serbia had owned Bosnia. And now, 700 years later, they decide they need to own it again. It's unclear how many people in Bosnia thought of themselves as Serbians. After 700 years, I don't know, I really question how many there would have been. However, because Serbia wanted to take Bosnia, they did not want Bosnia to be happy, because if Bosnia was happy, Bosnia would not rebel. And they wanted Bosnia to resist being taken over or annexed by the Austro-Hungarian Empire. So, why would Serbia want to kill this former heir to the throne? Because he was going to make Bosnia happy, then Bosnia would not rebel, and if Bosnia was not going to rebel, Serbia could not then take Bosnia over. So it's all very self-serving. So let's look at some of the events how it all started. And so on June 28th of 1914, Franz Ferdinand and his wife Sofia were killed by a young man from Serbia named Gavrilo Princip. Ferdinand was going to be the next emperor of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, so of course the people of Austria got super angry about this. Now, why did Princip do this? He wanted to make the point that Austria couldn't just take over all the small countries in the area, and he also thought that Austria was demanding too much from the poorest people. So the people had to continue to pay high taxes, but they didn't even have enough money to feed their own children. So now what I want you to do is, in a minute, I'm going to get you to click on this picture here, and that will take you to a video. All right? You don't need to play the whole thing. It's about an hour-long video. I only need you to watch the first 23 minutes and 53 seconds. As you watch it, I want you to fill out that the paper that I showed you that was about the comedy of errors. The way this assassination occurred was ridiculous. I don't mean to diminish the seriousness of the war, but this was ridiculous. It was a comedy of errors, and I want you to see the absurdity that started a war that killed 60 million people. And so as you are going through the video, I want you to write down each of the things that you think is absolutely absurd, and fill in that form that I showed you earlier, and then tomorrow when we get together again, I'm going to go over it with you, and we're going to have a wee bit of a chat about it. All right? So that's as far as I'm going to take you. Please make sure you watch this video. Please make sure that you fill in that form, and I'll see you all tomorrow.